Welcome to Learning Li-Fraumeni Syndrome. My name is Andy Last, and this video and audio podcast is a service of Living LFS, and our mission is to encourage, empower, and educate those living with Li-Fraumeni Syndrome. And you can learn more about that at livinglfs.org. And today, on the inaugural edition of our podcast, I would like to welcome Wendy Coleman. She is a licensed genetic counselor at Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much, Andy, for organizing this. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Absolutely. All right, let's get started. The goal here is to try to get information to people who have just been diagnosed, who are completely overwhelmed by this whole thing. So let's start with the basics. What is Li-Fraumeni Syndrome?
Well, Li-Fraumeni Syndrome is an inherited cancer condition. It's caused by mutations in a gene that's called TP53. Individuals who have mutations in this gene have an increased susceptibility to developing multiple types of cancer. Li-Fraumeni syndrome gets its kind of unique name from the first two physicians who described this condition, Dr. Li and Dr. Fraumeni. They had described this back in the late 1960s, and so that's where it gets its name, but it is caused by the mutations in the TP53 gene. So throughout kind of our talk today, sometimes I may say Li-Fraumeni syndrome, sometimes I may say TP53 mutation, but those are both talking about the same thing. The TP53 gene is a gene that we all have in our bodies. We each have two copies, one from mom and one from dad. And normally the TP53 gene is working in our bodies to protect us from developing cancer. Dr. Schiffman, who I work with here at Huntsman, often describes TP53 as the guardian of the genome. It's what helps make sure that our DNA is repaired properly, that cells grow and divide only when they're supposed to. And so when someone has a mutation causing one of those copies not to work properly, that leaves them less protected and increases their risk of developing cancer. So Li-Fraumeni syndrome is something that can affect both men and women. If a parent has Li-Fraumeni syndrome, they have a 50% chance of passing that mutation onto their children.
Okay, so for somebody that's hearing this news for the first time, that's pretty heavy. And actually, I remember when I was first diagnosed, my response was, wow, scientifically, that's really interesting. It didn't sink in until much later what the gravity of this situation is, what it actually meant to me as somebody with Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And I will probably end up just calling it LFS as we're talking along because it's so much easier to say.
Yes.
So why would someone receive genetic testing? What would be the thing that would cause them to be tested for LFS?
So there's really kind of two situations in which someone is going to be offered testing for Li-Fraumeni syndrome. One is because someone's already been diagnosed with it in the family. So once someone has been identified as having a TP53 mutation, testing is then often offered or recommended for other relatives to help determine if anyone else in the family, has inherited that risk, so that they have the opportunity to be proactive and do some screening. I think for families where this is a known diagnosis, this is information that they're hearing from family members, and depending on how they're related to that person, like I said, in general, you'll have a 50-50 chance of having inherited that as well. So individuals will be making decisions about whether or not they want to be tested for the mutation that's been identified in their family. The second situation in which testing for Li-Fraumeni syndrome would come up is when a doctor or a genetic counselor is reviewing a patient's personal and family history, and notes that there is an unusually strong pattern of cancer in the family that suggests that there could be a hereditary risk, and they may recommend genetic testing as a step to determine is this risk due to a TP53 mutation? Is it maybe due to something else? So there are going to be some people who are the first person in their family who is having this workup done, and genetic testing is part of that initial process. I've provided you with some slides that I think you're going to post as well. And on those slides, I have listed some of the factors that could prompt a doctor or a genetic counselor to recommend genetic testing of the TP53 gene. Some of those there are certain types of tumors which just on their own are so strongly linked to TP53 mutations that we suggest genetic testing for anyone who's diagnosed with an adrenocortical tumor, a choroid plexus tumor, rhabdoid tumors, or rhabdomyosarcomas, with anaplastic features would be examples of tumors just on their own would prompt an evaluation. Individuals who have multiple family members who have been diagnosed with Li-Fraumeni associated cancers at young ages would also fall into that list that we may offer testing for. But one thing also to bring up for your members and your listeners is that genetic testing for TP53 is becoming much, much more common. In the past, we really only offered this testing to people who had these very specific histories of these very classic Li-Fraumeni cancers. And that was because genetic testing was really hard and it was expensive, and so you only did it when you had a really good reason to. Genetic testing has now become a lot easier for us to do, and we can now look at lots of genes for the same price and effort that we used to look at just one or two. So now TP53 is being included in genetic tests that are being ordered for lots of different reasons. Because individuals who have a mutation in TP53 can have an increased risk for really almost any type of cancer. Yeah. Laboratories now include this gene on most of their tests related to hereditary cancer. So, something that we're encountering in our clinic is, meeting with people who've been found to have a TP53 mutation, and they maybe didn't even really know that was something that they were being tested for. Right. And it wasn't something that necessarily had been highly anticipated before their testing, but it kind of came up incidentally as they were maybe being worked up more generally for breast cancer risk or something like that. Mm-hmm.
And that would be the situation if somebody presented with a history of breast and ovarian cancer. It might be less likely, a family history, I should say, it might be less likely that they'd be tested for TP3. That might be more something that they would look for BRCA or something like that. Is that true?
Well, so if someone presented with breast and ovarian cancer, BRCA1 and 2, the BRCA genes, would be our first guess as to what's going on. But in the way genetic testing is now most commonly ordered, because there is, overlap and there are other genes that can also associate with breast cancer risk, most patients will be tested with what we call a multi-gene panel that will include the gene we're most concerned about, the BRCA genes, but then also include, maybe a few dozen other genes that could be related to breast or ovarian cancer as well. And that's where TP53 would, could get, included in those tests and could show up sometimes unexpectedly.
So this is a big deal for somebody that's just learning this. What if somebody is told, because of your family history, we would like you to have genetic testing. What if I decide against it?
So, that's a really good question. And, the decision to have genetic testing is always a personal decision. And that's why we really encourage people to have a chance to, talk with a genetic counselor or an experienced clinician before making a decision about that. So they really know, why is this testing being recommended? What do they suspect might be going on? What genes are they going to look at? And, how might the findings affect my care and the care for my family members? Those are always good questions to ask. Now, if someone decided not to have genetic testing, once again, we kind of have two different situations to think about. For somebody who is in a family with already a known diagnosis of Li-Fraumeni syndrome, someone's been found to have a TP53 mutation, the relative is at risk for that, but decides not to be tested themselves, then our general recommendation is, that we would follow you like you have Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And, because you may or may not, but our recommendation is that you be screened, as though you did until we were proven otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The situation is a little bit more, I think, challenging for the families that, for someone who maybe has a family history of cancer that's unusual, it seems to suggest some risk, but without testing, if we don't know what that is, we can make recommendations, based on family history, but it is more difficult for us to know exactly how best to take care of a person. For example, if someone was diagnosed with breast cancer, say at age 25, mm-hmm. That certainly raises the red flag of a hereditary risk. If that was due to a BRCA1 or 2 or BRCA mutation, we would know that that woman is at risk for breast and ovarian cancer, mm-hmm. and we could target those areas for screening. But if her breast cancer occurred due to TP53, we wouldn't really know that she could be at risk for brain tumors and sarcomas and other things, just based on her history alone. Mm-hmm. So, if someone doesn't, chooses not to have genetic testing, like I said, if we already knew that the family had Li-Fraumeni syndrome, we would advise, continuing to follow you as though you were at risk. For individuals with more unclear family histories, in the absence of genetic testing, we would do our best to make recommendations based on family history, but we may be missing some of the screening that would be recommended if a TP53 mutation were confirmed as the cause of the cancer risk.
Okay. One of the things that causes a lot of confusion is that people will get their results and it's a variant of unknown significance, or it's LFS-like, or it's mosaic. Can you give us some explanations of those three?
Yeah. So first let's tackle the dreaded variants of uncertain significance. We all have genetic differences. This is why each one of us is unique, right? Some of us have blue eyes and some of us have brown eyes, and some of us have type A blood and some of us have type O blood. This is all because our DNA is not exactly the same. And so, when a laboratory does genetic testing, and they're looking at our genetic code, it's not like it spells out, and this gene does not work, and and you have an increased risk for cancer. It's not that clear. Each one of our genetic codes is going to be a little bit different, and the lab has to sort out whether or not a particular change is, just part of normal human variation, or if it is associated with actually causing the gene not to work, mm-hmm. And causing an increased risk. So when a laboratory finds a variant, a different letter in the genetic code, maybe than what they typically see, if they don't have much information about that, they will go ahead and call that as uncertain. Now, overall, most things that are initially, are come in as uncertain do end up being classified as benign, but some, will be determined to be associated with a real mutation and the risks that go along with Li-Fraumeni syndrome. So when having genetic testing done, it's important for people to be aware that this is a possible outcome, and to talk with the provider who's ordering the testing about, what is going to happen if we find this. A lot of times there can be variability in how laboratories interpret some variants that may depend on what information they have access to. So some of the things that we do as genetic counselors when we encounter variants of uncertain significance are contacting multiple laboratories to find out how, if others maybe have more information on this.
So
We
this
look
is
at
information isn't necessarily networked across all of the genetic testing services and all of that kind of thing. You're literally having to call about and say, do you know anything new that we don't have yet?
Right. There are some efforts to try to coordinate sharing of information between labs. There are some resources. One national resource is something called ClinVar, where a lot of laboratories are encouraged to share their data. And so that's a good starting place. But, we often reach out and double check with laboratories that maybe haven't reported things to see if they know something else. We, will review the literature to see what else we can find about that. Sometimes there can be computer models that can help give us some insight into whether or not a particular variant is helping or, would be affecting how the gene worked, or maybe it's in part of the gene that's less important for the functions. So therefore that difference is unlikely to make a change. So we try to kind of piece these pieces of information together to try to give patients as much information as possible about, whether or not this has a likelihood of ultimately being classified as a mutation or maybe pointing more towards something that would be benign. So, so generally when we find something and the consensus amongst, all laboratories is that this is just uncertain and we don't have enough information at that point in time. Our general approach then is to make recommendations based on the patient's personal and family history. We don't want to be overly aggressive because we think someone has Li-Fraumeni syndrome when they may not.
Right.
But if there was some indication to do testing, there must have been something going on in the family. And so we don't want to, miss screening for those risks because this mutation hasn't been determined yet either.
Right. All right. So let's talk about LFS-like. What does that mean?
Well, so I think the term for LFS-like has, kind of evolved over time and really kind of came about to describe families in which, they had a history of cancer that was suggestive of Li-Fraumeni syndrome, but we can't identify a mutation. So, this is genetic testing still is not perfect. It's possible that we may be missing certain types of mutations. It's also possible that there may be other genes out there that are causing a similar risk that we just haven't identified or matched up. So a negative genetic test when we're working up a family for the first time doesn't necessarily rule out a risk or necessarily rule out, a diagnosis of Li-Fraumeni syndrome. For a family with a strong history, they may be put into this Li-Fraumeni-like category and still offered a lot of the same screening. We've certainly had this experience at Huntsman where we had a family with a very strong history, looked very much like a Li-Fraumeni family, but testing that they had in the late 90s, early 2000s were normal and did not identify any mutation. Years later, we were able to retest them and able to discover a large deletion that was a type of mutation that hadn't been previously tested.
Oh, wow.
So technology is changing, and it's likely that, these Li-Fraumeni-like families will end up with some sort of more specific, definition as things go along, and our technology is able to pinpoint what's going on in them.
Let's talk about mosaicism. What is that?
Oh, mosaicism.
Exactly.
So our new approaches to genetic testing that have become available in the last few years are very sensitive. And we're realizing that genetic testing, the technology that we use when we're doing these multi-gene panels, looking at lots of genes at the same time, this type of technology is able to identify genetic mutations that are present in low levels in the blood. Generally, when we think about somebody having an inherited condition, that mutation is present in about half their DNA. So as I'd mentioned in the very beginning, we've got 2 copies of TP53, one from mom and one from dad. So if you have a mutation in one copy of TP53, when we look at, when we do genetic testing and look at someone's DNA, we would see a signal for, of that half the DNA has the normal sequence and half would have the mutation. But laboratories started reporting out individuals who maybe had a TP53 mutation present in maybe 20% of their cells. And so the thought was that this maybe is related to something that we call mosaicism. So when you think about any genetic condition that could be passed down in families, there always has to be a first person, right? That mutation had to arise in one individual to then be passed down to subsequent generations. And so that can happen with LFS too, that someone is the first person. And generally that mutation has occurred in the sperm or the egg that became that individual. And so when that embryo was created, it had one working copy of TP53 and one mutation, and half the DNA would be the normal copy and half would be the copy with the mutation. However, it's also possible that that first mutation could occur a little bit later in development. So we have a sperm and egg with working TP53 that make that embryo, and somewhere, as the cells are dividing, that TP53 mutation occurs by chance.
Okay.
And then from that point on, the cells that were derived from that original cell with the mutation will all have the mutation, but the other cells that had already been growing and dividing would still have working TP53. So we have somebody who is mosaic, meaning that they're a mix. They've got some cells that have a TP53 mutation and some that don't. Now, that situation is very rare, and only very, very few cases have actually been proven to be that situation in which a person is truly a mosaic, a mix of different types of cells in their body. What we're finding that these kind of unusual test results are maybe more likely due to than mosaicism is the fact that we can have TP53 mutations in our blood that can just occur kind of due to chance. As we get older, and you think about your white blood cells that have been dividing for decades and decades,
Right.
By chance, we can accumulate mutations that would be just floating around in some of our random blood cells. Sometimes we can see an increased risk for these mutations in the blood as effects after chemotherapy. When we started using this new genetic testing technology about 3 years ago and started to find these people who didn't have quite this clear-cut, 50-50 split, the thing that we knew about at that point in time from genetics was, well, maybe they're mosaic. But now that we have studied this, further over the last few years, we really think that most of these cases are due to just kind of some abnormal populations of cells that are in the blood that cause these low levels of mutations. These types of mutations cannot, they're not affecting cancer risk in other parts of the body. They cannot be passed on to family members.
Wow.
There's some suggestion or concern that maybe they could be a marker of a risk for developing an actual hematological cancer down the road. And so that's something important to note. But when someone is the first person in their family who's being tested for TP53, and really we get almost any TP53 results in them, we generally are recommending some additional testing to confirm that this is indeed a, inherited mutation that was present in the sperm or the egg and is really causing the person to have Li-Fraumeni syndrome versus, these other situations in which we may be, just because our technology is so sensitive now, picking up these very low levels, of mutations that are due to other things. So, in the slides that I provided, the thing that I wanted to really emphasize is that having a TP53 mutation identified does not necessarily always mean you have Li-Fraumeni syndrome, particularly for somebody who maybe TP53 was included on the test, but the primary concern was that they had some relatives with breast cancer, and we didn't really see these other Li-Fraumeni cancers in the family. If that finding isn't fitting with the family history, we should really question that and make sure that this really wasn't some sort of other incidental finding that was picked up.
So this science truly is evolving. It's changing in the middle of all of. I mean, I just recently saw a study or a paper that was released that said that there may be a much higher prevalence of people with Li-Fraumeni syndrome than originally expected.
So, there have been reports that have suggested that. I think now it would also be interesting to go back to some of those reports and look to see how many of these unexpected TP53 mutation carriers were actually due to some of these other issues. The technical term that the genetics community has been using to describe when people have levels of TP53 in their blood that are not due to an inherited mutation, we call it CHIP. And it stands for clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential.
Wow.
Okay, say that 10 times fast. But now, a lot of times these studies that have done, taken large groups of patients and run these big panel tests on them or sequenced their genomes, many of them did not have a lot of follow-up to really sort out, can we prove that this TP53 mutation was actually, occurs in other family members, so we really do know that it's inherited, or that, it's not due to these other factors, and that's going to be really important. TP53, this seems to be unique to this gene. We don't see this happening or kind of coming up in test results for a lot of other genes that we are often testing for. We don't see people coming back with with BRCA mutations that are kind of occurring in this way where we're maybe seeing some cells in their blood, but it wasn't something that they had inherited. So I think that TP53 is a unique gene. It may be kind of susceptible to these mutations occurring over time as we get older in ways that, other genes are not. And it's something that we've never, it's obviously been present in humans forever. We just didn't have the technology to test for it. So, it's going to be really important to look at new studies coming out that talk about TP53 and seeing how they really fine-tuned this, because a lot of these reports, are suggesting that maybe the cancer risks in TP53 aren't as high as we used to think. And we want to make sure that we're not making some of those assumptions because we're including people who really didn't have the mutation throughout their body.
I see. Okay. Let's get back to, if you do have a diagnosis of Li-Fraumeni syndrome, how does that change your treatment options if you develop cancer?
This is a question that we get asked a lot, and I think one of the concerns with when we know somebody has a TP53 mutation, and we know that may make them more susceptible to the effects of radiation or alkylating chemotherapies, there's a concern that we don't want to give any sort of treatment that could maybe put them at higher risk for getting a second cancer. However, the important thing that we really emphasize to our patients is that the most important thing we can do is to treat the cancer you have. And so our recommendation to patients is always, even if you have a TP53 mutation, we give you the best treatment that we can for that cancer that you have. If there are options that are equal in terms of the likelihood of treating and curing that cancer. Then if we can choose one that maybe would have less impact on second cancer risk, like just an example that comes to mind, if a woman was diagnosed with an early breast cancer, we could maybe treat her with a lumpectomy and radiation, or we could treat her with a mastectomy. Having Li-Fraumeni syndrome may lead us to thinking about mastectomy as a way to treat her cancer and help actually reduce the risk of getting a future breast cancer by removing more breast tissue and avoiding exposing her tissue to radiation. But we certainly don't want patients with Li-Fraumeni syndrome to feel like they should, turn down treatment that does involve radiation or chemotherapy, because if that's what's needed to treat the cancer they have, then we want to do that. And we certainly have screening approaches that we can employ to help watch people carefully to be on the lookout for subsequent cancer risks down the road.
So after a genetic counselor has given you the news, you've got Li-Fraumeni syndrome, from that point, what else can a genetic counselor do for someone?
Well, I like to think that we can still offer a lot.
Of course.
Gen counselors, certainly have a role in helping to get that genetic testing coordinated, help interpret these variants and things like that. But, we're really there to be your support system. There's a lot of information that goes with this. I mean, you alluded to at the very beginning of our talk of just kind of what it felt like to hear that news at the first time.
Right.
To take in all the information that there is out there about Li-Fraumeni syndrome, that's likely going to take many, many conversations. And we're happy to have as many of those as someone would like. We're happy to help communicate to their other providers and educate them about Li-Fraumeni syndrome. Here at our clinic in Huntsman, the gen counselors are really kind of in that quarterback role of trying to help make sure things are cohesive between the care providers. People's needs are going to change over time. Some individuals are going to be diagnosed with Li-Fraumeni syndrome as children. And, what information is appropriate for them to hear about or what they can even understand is going to be very different than later in life. And so revisiting with a gen counselor to get that age-appropriate updates. We can help tap people into support resources, wonderful organizations like yours, and psychological support. And, just like I said before, as things go through the lifespan, there are going to be different issues that come up, and Li-Fraumeni may mean different things. When, someone who is diagnosed young gets to the age that they're thinking about having their own families, then there would be a whole another set of discussions about their options for reproductive planning. So a gen counselor hopefully is someone that can be a resource to people with Li-Fraumeni syndrome forever.
Let me ask you that. When you do end up with a child, let's say somebody who's 10, who has LFS, how do you as the genetic counselor explain that to a 10-year-old? Parents, it's on you.
That's what we try to avoid.
Right.
I'm sure that parents are struggling with those challenges too. We really try to present information in an age-appropriate way. And I think that it is very helpful. While we don't want to put this burden on the parents, it's really helpful to do this jointly with the parents so that, we can help provide the parents some coaching as well about some good ways to talk about this at home. But we try to do things like helping it helps us to understand what the child is already aware of. If the child has just seen someone in the family go through cancer or is going through cancer themselves, we want to help put this finding in context for what they've already experienced. So that's going to be important as to, kind of where they're coming from in all this. Also, we do try to be very positive of helping to reinforce the idea that this information is something that is going to help us and help them take better care of them. Yes, you're going to need maybe more checks than your friends, but this is to keep you healthy. We really want to foster a sense of empowerment. We're very fortunate. Recently at our clinic at Huntsman, we've had a pediatric psychologist join our team. So that's provided a great resource for really helping make sure that we're identifying the kids who maybe have more needs and need more support through this. The other resource that we've been tapping into is our child life specialists at the pediatric hospital. And they're a great resource for just helping prep kids for procedures and things. We've got even very young kids who have been given some coaching on how to lay still through an MRI. We're able to get them through without sedation. So there are a lot of resources out there, a lot of people with expertise in taking these really complex things and making them less scary for kids.
Fantastic.
And, we really encourage people to look into those.
And we do have a slide that I'll put up now that actually shows how you can find a genetic counselor if you are in need of one. That is at that website there, which is nsgc.org. So we're speaking to Wendy Coleman. She is a licensed genetic counselor at Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah. And let's get into talking about what Huntsman is actually doing. Tell us about your genetic cancer study.
We have a registry of Li-Fraumeni patients that we follow. Our registry is, really, it's kind of the source of that all of our research flows from. For the participants enrolled in our registry, it allows us to collect data on their family history and specific genetic mutations that we can use to look and better understand what affects the cancer risk in these families. It also allows us to track outcomes of screening. We have worked with Dr. David Melkin's group in Toronto to publish on the outcomes of our screening protocols. And this is really helping to kind of guide what the optimal approaches are for detecting cancer at an early stage. We also like to get blood from our patients because we are doing a lot of work, once again, trying to understand the TP53 gene, what it's doing and how we could better understand that and intervene to help develop treatments that are going to reduce this cancer risk that goes with these inherited mutations. And I think people are maybe most familiar with our work in studying TP53, not only in humans, but in elephants. One of our researchers here, Dr. Josh Schiffman, had been involved in research that had noted that really large animals actually tend to get fewer cancers than smaller animals. And you would think that the bigger the animal, the more cells, the more chances of getting cancer, right? That would be, the hypothesis. But this had been noted in the scientific community for many years that the opposite was true. The bigger the animal, the less cancer we seem to see. Once the elephant genome was sequenced, it was discovered that while people have 2 copies of TP53, elephants have 40 copies.
Those lucky elephants.
Well, it makes sense that they had to come up with some strategy to prevent cancer. That, prompted Dr. Schiffman to do some research on this, and we did some experiments in which we actually compared elephant cells to human cells to the cells of people with LFS. And we found that when these cells were exposed to damaging radiation, the elephant cells self-destructed at twice the rate of the human cells. Human cells were more likely to try to fix themselves and kind of keep plugging along. Our hypothesis was that the elephant strategy was, why bother trying to save this damaged cell? We've got a lot of cells. Let's just get rid of this. It was a really exciting, initial study, and Dr. Schiffman has been following this up with some additional work. He's working with a chemical engineer in Israel to figure out how we can package elephant TP53 into nanoparticles that can help deliver that elephant DNA into cells. They've done some experiments where we have actually gotten successfully the elephant TP53 into cancer cell lines and had some promising results. So this is all in very beginning stages, cells in a dish, but I think it's really, with something like Li-Fraumeni syndrome, that is, it's been a puzzle that we've had for such a long time. I think getting creative and thinking outside of the box. What can we learn? What can we learn from these other creatures around us, who have seemed to be able to solve this cancer puzzle a little bit better. So we can't put elephant TP53 into someone's cancer right now. But like I said, I think that this is, a new way of thinking about things, and it'll be really exciting to see where this leads.
Is that a goal, to put elephant TP3 ultimately into human subjects?
That, if we can, the data can progress, that we can show that it helps cause the cancer cells and growing in a dish to self-destruct. And then, if that could be expanded to animal models, and we're continuing to see that's a promising approach, then the goal would be humans. Like I said, we've got steps in that, in that process. But yeah, I think that's, one of his hopes for the future for this.
Wendy, how can people follow up? How can people get more information? How can people follow the research?
Contact our Cancer Genetics study. We've included that information in the slides that we provided, and we're happy to enroll people in our registry. Regardless of where they are, they can participate via mail. That can get people, into our system, and we can keep people updated. There are also other great programs as well, and in the slides we provided some information about resources. The NIH also has a wonderful study following patients with Li-Fraumeni syndrome that provides screening. So we really encourage them to, reach out to various resources. I think also getting involved with groups like yours is a great way for people to be kept up to date and to get involved and, kind of be part of the LFS community.
Wendy Coleman is the licensed genetic counselor at Huntsman Cancer Institute at the University of Utah. Wendy, thank you so much for taking the time to appear with me today on Learning Li-Fraumeni Syndrome. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you.